Hey, sleepyheads. Welcome back to Dreaming Through Ages, the place where history whispers, where stories soften your breath, and where even the loudest wars become lullabies. You're safe here. It's time to let the day fall away, to close your eyes, and to follow a trail of footsteps that once walked in silence, but carried the weight of freedom. Tonight, we don't tell the story of generals. We don't march with armies. We listen for the quiet ones, the women who changed history by vanishing into it. This is the story of the D-Day girls. And this is how it begins. Before the invasion. Before the beaches turned red. Before the flags were raised and the streets filled with song. There was waiting. Endless waiting. A breath held in the throat of Europe. And somewhere inside that breath, in the quiet corners of France, the resistance stirred. But even it needed help. It needed ghosts. It needed fire, dressed in silk and skin. So the British sent shadows. They sent women and not soldiers. Not spies, at least not by name. They were mothers, daughters, shopkeepers, students, lovers. And they became weapons. Let me take you back to where their stories truly begin. Not with bombs, not with orders, but with choices. It was 1942. France was broken in half. The North was in the grip of the Nazis, and the South watched the sky, hoping the wind would carry salvation from across the Channel. In London, a small office buzzed with whispers. The SOE, Special Operations Executive, a secret branch made not of uniforms, but of liars, poets, and dreamers. They believed war could be fought with the radio static, with ink, with a smile that held no truth. They believed in the quiet kill, and they believed women were the best at it. They looked for the ones who had nothing to prove and everything to lose. Andrée was one of the first. She didn't look like a warrior. She had soft brown eyes, a compact body, and hands used to helping, not hurting. She worked in a pharmacy, measured powders, filled prescriptions, spoke gently to the sick. But war doesn't ask your profession. It only asks one thing. Are you willing? She said yes. And that yes became the first step toward fire. She was sent to England to learn the art of silence, explosives, disguise, radio as codes, death. Andrée didn't flinch. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had already lost more than fear could take. She trained in cold rain, with her hair damp and her resolve steady. She jumped from towers into mud. She memorized train routes, chemical reactions, the face of death without blinking. She was preparing to vanish. To become a name no one would say out loud. Odette Sansom was different. She had children. She had a life, or what was left of it, in a world that no longer felt like her own. She wasn't recruited. She volunteered. A letter went out. A request for photos of the French coast, harmless enough. Odette replied, but she forgot to hide her sharpness, her cleverness, her courage. They saw her, and they chose her. She left behind her daughters, not because she stopped loving them, but because she loved them too much to let the enemy win. And then there was Lise de Bersac, a whisper wrapped in silk. Born in Mauritius, educated, elegant, the kind of woman people underestimated until they spoke to her. Her voice was the wind on marble. Her eyes never wavered. She didn't ask if she would be in danger. She only asked what she could do. 3 women, 1 mission. to go into the heart of the wolf and light fires in the dark. They weren't trained to fight like men. They were trained to disappear like ghosts. They were told they'd be alone, that they could be captured, that their bodies would be broken if their spirits weren't already. They nodded, and then they smiled. Tonight, as you lie here, and the quiet of sleep begins to settle in, think of the first night Andrée arrived in France. Alone. Falling from the sky, parachute slicing cold air, above a sleeping village. She landed in silence, in the dark, in the land of her birth, now poisoned by boots and bullets. And she began to work. But that is a story. The wind in occupied France didn't sound the same. It had a weight to it, as if the trees themselves had learned to whisper, so the enemy wouldn't hear them breathe. Andrée Borel, only just past her 20s, was dropped into that silence. Her parachute opened like a white flower in the sky. She landed without sound, in the fields of Touraine, wet with night, stars watching her, as if they knew what she had come to do. She was the first female wireless operator to arrive in France, and she was already a ghost in plain sight. She moved through villages where signs were in German, where fear grew like ivy on broken walls. She smiled at soldiers, nodded at neighbors, wrote messages in invisible ink, laid wires under blankets, all the while pretending to be someone else. Her name was fake. Her passport was false. But her mission was as real as her heartbeat. She met with the resistance in silence. A knock on a door. A candle flickering twice. A single match lit and extinguished. These were the signs of survival. These were her tools. Far away back in England, Odette Sansom prepared for her own journey. She studied her cover story. She repeated it in her mind like a lullaby sung to herself. She would be a mother traveling to visit a sick relative. She would have children's photos in her wallet. Her hands would tremble just enough to be believable, but not enough to reveal the truth. She knew what could happen, what they'd do to her if they discovered who she really was. But every night, before she closed her eyes, she pictured her daughters sleeping safely, and that image was stronger than any fear. Lise de Bessac entered France not by parachute, but by bicycle. She pedaled through villages with a satchel full of secrets and a smile, as calm as a quiet stream. She pretended to be an art historian, a curious traveler, a woman too elegant to be dangerous. She observed troop movements, memorized train timetables, photographed fortifications with a camera hidden in a scarf. She didn't carry a gun. She didn't need one. Her mind was sharper than any blade. Each woman moved alone. Their paths rarely crossed. Their names were never spoken aloud. But they were part of something larger than themselves, a quiet network, woven by whispers, codes, and impossible bravery. Andrée sent messages back to London by tapping on keys in the dark. Every dot, every dash, a risk. Every signal, why, it's a lifeline. The Gestapo hunted wireless operators like wolves. If they caught her, they wouldn't ask questions. They'd act, ruthlessly, swiftly. Still she tapped. Still she sent hope through static. Odette made her first contact. A Frenchman, older, careful, with eyes like storm clouds. He asked if she knew what the price of failure was. She said yes. She said it softly, not like a soldier, like a mother who had already made peace and with loss. They shared no hugs, no long goodbyes. Just a look, the kind that says, we may not see each other again. And then she stepped into the shadow of war. Meanwhile, Lise set up safe houses, small apartments with old furniture and secrets tucked into drawers. She gave resistance fighters places to sleep, to heal, to breathe. Sometimes she'd leave fresh bread on the windowsill so the house wouldn't look empty. Sometimes she'd listen to the church bells and wonder if they were ringing for the living or the dead. But always she kept moving. One whisper too long could mean capture. She had to be the wind. Always there, never seen. Andrée's radio pulse became the heartbeat of the underground. She relayed when shipments would come. She guided the drops. She told the British where to land. But she knew her time was short. Every message increased the chance they'd trace her signal. Every day she survived was a quiet miracle. And still, she sent one more, and one more, and one more. Not because she believed she'd survive, but because she believed someone else might. In the middle of it all, they were alone. But in the quiet spaces between missions, they wrote letters, small fragments of warmth. Odette's letters to her daughters were soft, hopeful. She never mentioned the cold, or the guns, or the threats. Only love. Always love. As your eyes grow heavier, and your body softens into rest, remember this. The world is not only shaped by the loud and the powerful. It is held together by those who choose to act in silence, who step into danger, not for glory, but for peace. Andrée, Odette, Lise. Tonight, they are with you. It's quiet now. The kind of quiet that feels like memory, like pages turning in a book you once loved as a child. The wind moves gently outside the window, but inside, here with us, we are far away. We are in 1942. France is bruised, the sky bruised with it. But in the quiet, 3 women move like breath. Invisible, but full of life. They don't look like heroes. They look like you, like me. Like someone you pass on the street and forget in an instant. But history remembers them now. And so do we. Andrée has moved again. The Gestapo is too close. Their radio detection vans roll through the streets, sniffing the air for any signal that doesn't belong. So she packs quickly. Wires, batteries, the folded map with smudges at the corners. The photo she never looks at for too long. She moves like someone who's learned the art of vanishing. Each safe house is just a pause, not a place, just a whisper between silences. She doesn't say goodbye. She never does. Goodbyes are loud. And she lives in quiet. Odette, now in occupied territory, has begun to feel the weight of constant pretending. Each street she walks could be her last. Every knock at the door could be boots. Still she smiles, buys bread from the baker, tips the boy who delivers milk, as if her heartbeat isn't hiding in the folds of her coat. She writes small messages, folds them into lipstick tubes, hides them under floorboards. She learns that resistance isn't always fire. Sometimes it's paper. Sometimes it's knowing when not to speak. Lise travels by train, holding a book she doesn't read. The name on her ticket isn't hers. The destination changes at the last second. She watches people, German officers with laughter too loud, farmers with boots muddy from land they no longer own, Mothers rocking babies, with eyes that haven't closed in days. She breathes slowly, deliberately, because even breath, too fast, can betray. In one village, Lise meets an old woman who offers her water. The woman doesn't know who she is, only that she's polite, that her French is clean, that her eyes are steady. They sit in silence, and in that silence, Lise remembers why she came. Not for war, not for glory, but so that someday this woman might pour water without fear. Andrée is tired. Not in her body, in her bones. She hasn't slept through a night in weeks. She dreams while awake. Dreams of sirens, of hands pulling her away, of codes repeating, until her breath matches the rhythm of Morse. But she keeps going, because the drops are working, because the resistance is growing louder, and because London still answers when she sends her signal. She isn't alone. Not really. She is the thread between worlds. Odette receives a message, a meeting. Late, by the river. She walks slowly, not because she's afraid, but because she's learned that even courage needs time. She waits by a bridge. A man appears. They speak without speaking. He hands her a note. She hides it in the hem of her dress. They part without turning back. The river moves on, as if nothing happened. But something did. History took another breath. Lise hears her code name on the radio from London. A song plays afterward, a signal. Her instructions are clear. She must prepare for something larger, something near, something called D-Day. But for now, she returns to her borrowed room, lights a candle, stares at the flame, and thinks of the ocean, how still it looks before the storm. Sleep is calling. You feel it, don't you? That gentle pull behind your eyes, like dusk settling over hills you once walked as a child. The nights grew heavier, longer. Each breath carried more weight. But the women didn't stop. They had become part of the landscape now. The shifting fog, the creaking door, the figure that moves just before dawn. They lived in half-names, half-truths, and rooms where no one asked questions. Because in war, truth could kill, but silence could save. Andrée changed safe houses again. It was routine now. A knock on the back door, a candle left in the window, a single nod exchanged in a dark alley. She hadn't seen her real name in months. It no longer mattered. What mattered was the message. She waited for transmissions from London like a heartbeat. At 2 a.m., she sat in the corner of a cellar, wires stretched out like veins, her fingers moving like she was sewing a new world together. Each message carried the weight of lives. There was a man who helped carry her equipment to Baker by day, a shadow by night. He said little. But one night, as they hid under the stairs, waiting for Boots to pass, he whispered, "I named my daughter after you." Andrée didn't respond. She couldn't. Some truths were too heavy to hold in words. Odette moved through the countryside, with the grace of a ghost. Her shoes worn, her coat heavy with secrets. She had learned to change her face. Not with makeup, but with expression. A mother in the morning, a messenger by noon, a soldier after dark. The children in town liked her. They waved. One small girl handed her a flower. She smiled and knelt and whispered, "Keep it safe." It wasn't about the flower. It was about hope. Even the smallest kindness was a rebellion in a world that punished love. Lise spent a night in an abandoned chateau. No fire, no light, only the wind and the ticking of her watch. She had a map spread across the floor, pencil lines, where supply drops would soon fall. Each X was a promise. She hadn't slept in 2 days. She didn't feel tired anymore, just full of purpose. In the silence, she remembered her brother, back in London, training others just like her. Would they all survive? She didn't know. But she would make space for them to arrive safely. That was her gift. Andrée passed a checkpoint. Her forged papers still smelled of fresh ink. A guard asked her name. She said it without hesitation. Not her name, but the name they gave her. The guard looked her over. For a moment, the world paused. Then he waved her through. She didn't look back. She never looked back. Looking back could break you. Odette's contact didn't show. She waited 2 hours, at the edge of a field, her boots soaked through, her hands wrapped around a flask she didn't drink from. A fox crossed her path. Its eyes glowed like 2 small lanterns in the dark. It didn't run. Neither did she. When she finally turned to leave, there was a note pinned to a fence post. 3 words. He's been taken. Her chest tightened. But she didn't cry. There was no time for grief. Not yet. Only the mission. Only the work. Lisa met with a resistance leader. He was skeptical. Not of her skill, but of her being a woman. He asked, "Do you know what they do to women when caught?" She smiled gently. Not cruel. Not proud. Just steady. She said, "I know. That's why I never will be." They weren't fearless, but they were braver than fear. They weren't soldiers, but they fought harder, because they weren't expected to fight at all. Andrée, Odette, Lise, 3 names, almost lost in history. But tonight, they live in your breath. The war was changing. You could feel it in the streets. Even the silence sounded different, like it was waiting. Andrée Borel was now one of the most trusted agents in France. But that didn't mean she was safe. It only meant she was important. And the important ones were watched. She moved like music no one could hear. Light on her feet. Careful with her eyes. Her radio, now hidden in the walls of a bakery, was her voice to London. And through her voice, sabotage took form. 1 message, 1 bridge, 1 delay. And somewhere far away, a train never arrived. She wasn't alone anymore. New agents had come. Men and women with aliases, and stories that looped like riddles. She helped them, without drawing attention. Taught them where to hide, how to walk, when not to speak. In one small attic, she whispered to a young man trembling in fear. He said, "I can't do this." She placed a hand on his arm. "Warm?" "Still." She whispered, "Then do it for those who can't." And he did. That night, he blew a hole in a rail line that stopped an entire German convoy. Odette was learning what pain felt like in silence. Not the physical kind. Not yet. The emotional weight. The pressure of pretending. To be calm. When your breath wants to run. She received word. One of her messages was intercepted. She burned her papers. Moved in the dark. Changed her name again. And still, she walked into town and smiled at the grocer. That was her weapon. Grace. Lise was gathering people. Quietly. Deliberately, she found couriers, messengers, safe housekeepers, farmers with sharp eyes, and children who didn't speak when strangers came. She didn't give them names, just tasks. She handed them notes, folded like prayers, maps with corners torn, small weapons disguised in sewing boxes. And always, she said thank you. Politeness was her shield, precision, her sword. One afternoon, Andrée sat beside a river. No disguise, no mission, just her, a crust of bread, and a wind that carried the scent of freedom from a land she could no longer touch. She didn't cry, but she didn't smile either. A child passed by with his mother, laughing, chasing a wooden toy. Andrée watched him, and something inside her softened. She whispered to herself, "This is why," then stood and vanished into the crowd. Odette met with another agent in the shadows of a ruined church. They didn't speak names, only what was necessary. He gave her documents. She gave him the time and location of a German shipment. Before they parted, he looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "You're braver than I'll ever be." She didn't answer. Some truths don't need words. Lise heard something on the radio, a phrase, slipped between songs. It was meant for her. Her mission had shifted. D-Day was near. The preparations would intensify. She took a breath, deep and quiet, wrote down every detail, folded the paper, and placed it under a floor tile in the library of an empty schoolhouse. Then she left, without a sound. The three of them would never meet in person. Not as friends, not as allies, but their work was woven together. And somewhere, beneath the noise of the world, they were building something unbreakable. Now, as your breathing slows, as your body sinks deeper into sleep, you might wonder, how did they endure it? The fear? The weight? The silence? Maybe it was because they believed in something more. Something soft. Something warm. Something simple. Like you, drifting now. Safe. Still. Let that warmth hold you. Let it carry you through the night. Their story isn't over. Andrée, Odette, Lise. Their world never stopped shifting, and neither did they. Each morning was uncertain. Each night felt longer than the last. But they endured not because they were fearless, but because they believed someone had to carry the flame through the dark. Andrée received orders to prepare for a major sabotage, a train transporting weapons. Important, heavily guarded. She gathered the right people, old farmers, teenage boys. Two women who had never held tools, but knew how to listen. They waited under a moonless sky near the edge of the track, heartbeats pounding louder than footsteps. When the time came, they struck. One detonation, one flash, one sound that ripped through the night and scattered metal like birds taking flight. And then silence again. They vanished, melted into fields like nothing had happened. But something had. The train never reached the front. And that mattered. Odette moved north, to a new zone, a new identity. The air was colder, the streets tighter. She worked with a man named Peter. Sharp mind, quiet voice, kind eyes. He was her partner. They posed as a married couple. It made checkpoints easier. But it also made moments harder. Because when she looked at him, she saw the life she could have had if the world hadn't burned. They never spoke of it. But one night, while rain hit the glass like tapping fingers, he whispered, "If we make it through this, will you come find me?" And she said nothing, only nodded. That was enough. Lise was now coordinating drops. She rode by bicycle through villages, maps tucked into her waistband, a pistol taped under the seat. She rarely used it. Didn't want to. But it was there, like thunder hiding behind clouds. She marked fields with white sheets and lanterns, told farmers where to hide livestock, made sure supplies landed in the right hands. One night, after a successful drop, an old woman handed her a loaf of bread and simply said, "You remind me of my daughter." Lise smiled, thanked her, and kept going. But she carried that sentence for days, and there was always danger. But the real fear was not being caught. It was being forgotten. That everything risked would vanish, like their names from the records. Andrée once asked another agent, "What if no one remembers?" He said, "Then we remember each other." And they did. In silence. In passing glances. In the way they trusted without question. But nothing lasts forever. The Gestapo was closing in. Too many drops, too many messages, too many brave moves that left traces. Odette and Peter were arrested, captured in a hotel where they thought they were safe. She was taken to Paris, then to Frayne prison, interrogated, tortured. But she never broke, never gave a name, not one. She bit her tongue until blood filled her mouth before she let them know who she truly was. Andrée was taken next. Her cell was small, but her spirit was larger than the stone walls around her. She told them nothing. Nothing real, only fragments. They tried to crack her, but she stared at them with the same eyes that once watched trains from under bridges, calculating how to stop them. Her courage outlived her body. She was executed, quietly. No fanfare, no trial. But not forgotten. Never forgotten. Lise survived. She outlasted the storm. She kept moving America until the signal came from London. It was time. D-Day was coming. And the work they did, every message, every bicycle, every bridge burned, and every whisper passed made it possible. Without them, the landings would have been bloodier, slower, maybe even impossible. They stopped time, just long enough for the world to change. Now it's your time to rest, to let your breath fall deeper, to feel the softness return. Because you've walked with ghosts tonight, with women who walked silently so others could speak freely. The night holds them now, and it holds you too. Let go. Close your eyes. Let Andrée guide you through shadow. Let Odette wrap you in resilience. Let Lise ride beside you on a path that leads to morning. The D-Day girls are still with us. But now, before they crossed enemy lines, they were students of the invisible. This is where they became shadows. In a quiet village in England, far from the cities and crowds, the Special Operations Executive built a place not found on any map. A school without uniforms. A campus without classrooms. Just mud, cold, and eyes that watched everything. The women came alone, carried suitcases and small ones, wore clothes that didn't draw attention. They arrived under different names. Some barely spoke, some tried to joke, some simply nodded and waited. Andrée was one of the first. She stepped from the train and breathed in the damp air. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't brave either. She was ready. They learned to kill. With wire. With knives. With their hands. They learned to disappear. How to make themselves smaller. How to move without sound. how to lie without blinking. Every task was a test. Could you jump from a moving train? Could you break out of a locked room? Could you smile at a man who might kill you in the morning? There were no medals here. Only bruises, silence, and the weight of knowledge that no one could ever know your name. Odette came later, older, quieter. She had the air of someone who had seen storms and stood still. Her instructors noticed something different. She didn't ask many questions. She listened. During the escape drills, she didn't run the fastest, but she always found the quietest path, the least obvious door. She didn't panic, not even when they placed her in mock captivity and left her blindfolded for hours. Later, one instructor said, "She has already survived more than we could teach her." Lise stood out, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't help it. Her posture was elegant, her accent refined. She didn't look like someone who could burn down a rail depot, but when she held a pistol, her hand didn't shake. And when they asked her what she would do if caught, she simply said, "I would lie better than them." There were others, too, young women who'd worked in offices, on farms, in shops, who now crawled through dirt, learning to build explosives, from flour and sugar, from bicycle parts and watch springs. They trained in heels, in dresses, because they had to blend into a world that wouldn't see them coming. One night, instructors blindfolded everyone, led them into the woods, separated them, left them alone. The task was simple. Find your way back without being caught. Andrée moved like wind between trees. She knew how to listen to the dark. She paused when dogs barked, shifted when branches cracked. When she finally returned with mud on her cheek, her eyes held no fear, only certainty. Odette was next. She returned with torn stocking and a twig in her hair, but she was smiling. Lise returned dry, unseen, unmarked. One trainer whispered, "She doesn't walk through the woods. She glides." They were passed, certified, prepared. But nothing could prepare them for what waited across the channel. Still, they didn't hesitate. They asked for dates, for details, for the fastest way in. Because this wasn't just about sabotage. It was about reclaiming land with every breath, about becoming what the enemy never expected. On their last night at the training facility, the wind was cold. The stars were soft. The women sat in silence, watching their breath rise and disappear. Andrée traced letters in the frost. Odette whispered a prayer. Lise tied her hair back and stared straight ahead. None of them said goodbye. Goodbyes belong to people who expect to see each other again. The channel was cold that night, on gray skies, no stars, only the soft hum of the aircraft and the rhythm of breathing. Andrée sat alone in the dark fuselage, her parachute strapped tight, her hands steady on her lap. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Her heart didn't race. It waited, like a bell holding back a sound, until it was needed. Then the light flashed green. She stood, moved to the open door, looked down into the quiet fields of France, and let go. The parachute opened with a rustle. Not loud, not soft. Like the sound of pages turning in a story someone forgot to finish. She drifted through fog. Below her, dark shapes of trees and the curve of farmland stretched across shadowed hills. When her boots touched the earth, she dropped into a crouch, pulled her chute in quickly, listened. Silence. That meant she was still alive. And now, the mission had begun. Lise crossed by boat, disguised as a refugee. A woman in flight, her papers flawless, her posture calm. She arrived in Vichy, France, dressed like a tourist. Nothing dangerous. Nothing strange. She wore a scarf the color of smoke and glasses she didn't need. She looked like someone who belonged to no one. And that was the point. Odette arrived later. Her landing was less smooth. She twisted her ankle and ran but didn't flinch. Her first task, blend in. She walked slowly through small town and pretended to search for relatives. She smiled often. Not too much. Just enough. And always Mao, she listened. People talked in cafes, at markets, on benches outside churches. And every word became a thread she could stitch into a larger picture. Andrée set up her first base and tour. The safe house was above a bookshop. She entered through the back alley and climbed stairs that creaked in just the right way, not too loud, not too soft. The room smelled of paper and damp wood. She unpacked her radio, each piece wrapped in cloth, each part memorized like prayer. Then she waited, for the time, for the signal, for the moment her hand could speak again. To London, Lise cycled across the countryside. Her cover was simple, an art historian researching lost sculpture. She carried maps and notebooks. She visited old churches, took photos of statues, and in between, she mapped enemy movements. She drew troop positions between sketches of stained glass. She hid coordinates between the folds of travel brochures. She made danger look like culture. And in every village, she found someone to help her. A priest, a farmer, a girl who cleaned the inn, but kept her mouth shut and her ears open. Odette found her contact in a tiny bakery in Dijon. He was thin, eyes sunken from sleepless nights. He didn't greet her, just handed her a loaf of bread and whispered, "Inside." She walked away without looking back. In a private room, she found the message. A meeting point, a time, a warning. Gestapo were sniffing through the city. They'd picked up 2 couriers last week. She burned the note and scattered the ashes in a glass of red wine. It looked like nothing. It always had to. Andrée began broadcasting. Short messages. Urgent. Precise. She tapped through silence, like a heartbeat in Morse code. Every minute she transmitted was borrowed time. She changed her location every 2 days. Slept in closets, under floors, on rooftops. She ate little, smiled rarely, dreamed never. But she kept sending, because London kept answering. And that meant the world was still listening. One night, Lise stopped at a farm for shelter. The family let her stay in the barn. The youngest son asked if she was afraid. She paused, then said, "Yes. But I keep going anyway." He nodded, then gave her a jar of honey and said, "Good people deserve something sweet." She kept that jar until the end of the war. Odette stood by the river, where she was supposed to meet a resistance leader. She waited an hour, then 2. Finally, a note was dropped in her coat pocket by a stranger who never stopped walking. The message was clear. Change location. Surveillance was tight. She moved quickly. No luggage, no trace. And by morning, she was already someone else. There was a rhythm to the danger now. A quiet pulse that echoed through stone streets and winding alleys. Each day, they woke as strangers, and each night they went to sleep as ghosts. Andrée, Odette, Lise. They were no longer training. They were living the mission. And the mission was survival. Andrée rarely stayed in one place more than a night. Her radio was small now, but the signal was strong, stronger than most. She carried it in a box of oranges, wrapped in cloth soaked with lavender oil to mask the scent of the wires and battery acid. She transmitted from farms, abandoned churches, a deserted mill where the roof let starlight in. She never repeated a message. She never used the same code twice. London told her she was one of their best. But she didn't care about being the best. She only cared about being useful. In Lyon, Odette received news that one of her courier girls had been taken. 16. Brave. Vanished. Odette didn't let it show. Not on her face. Not in her breath. She simply moved. Burned old contacts. Changed hotels. Met with her local cell leader, so under the guise of a librarian delivering books. Each coded phrase was slipped between sentences about poetry and local politics. You had to speak two languages in France now, the one people heard, and the one that lived underneath. Lisa was building networks. She created a new circuit of saboteurs and safe houses. They called it the Garland Line. On paper, it didn't exist. But in the dark, it stretched like veins across occupied soil. Every agent had a false name. Every house, a second exit. Every route, a backup. She trained farmers to destroy tanks with jam jars filled with gasoline. She taught housewives how to fold maps into loaves of bread. It wasn't grand. It wasn't loud. It was slow, steady, and sharp as a whisper. One evening, Andrée met with a British airman whose plane had gone down near Bordeaux. He was injured, terrified, young. She didn't comfort him. She simply looked him in the eyes and said, "You have 5 seconds to decide if you want to live." He nodded. She helped him up, gave him civilian clothes, and by morning, he was on his way to Spain. She never saw him again. But months later, she received a coded message from London. "Bird returned, still flying." "Thank you." She smiled. Just once. Odette was being followed. She noticed it in the reflection of a bakery window. A man with gloves. 2 steps too close. She didn't panic. She turned left, then right, walked through a florist's shop, bought a rose, and exited through the back. By the time he caught up, she was gone. That night, she slept in a convent. No one asked who she was. The sisters only offered soup, and a place in the corner near the fire. She whispered her thanks, then fell asleep, with the rose still in her coat pocket. Lisa had her first near capture. A German patrol stopped her train, checked papers, questioned passengers. She sat still, calm, smiling gently, like a woman on holiday. When the officer asked what she was doing in France, she answered softly, "I'm here for the architecture." He looked her over, frowned, then moved on. She didn't breathe until the train began moving again. Later, she wrote in her notebook, "Charm is faster than bullets." Sometimes they thought about home, about warm kitchens, about the feel of real names. But mostly, they didn't. There wasn't time. Memory could get you killed. And hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. But even so, they dreamed. In flashes. In candlelight. In the hush between missions. You followed them far now. Through cities that no longer sleep. Through maps marked only in ink and blood. You're safe now. But they weren't. Still, they chose this. They chose silence, so others could speak. They chose danger, so others could sleep. Just like you are now. The winter came fast. Gray mornings, hollow winds, empty hands clutching coats in silence. The world moved slower, but the danger didn't. Andrée worked out of a butcher's cellar, a dim, cold room with hooks on the walls and the smell of salt in the air. Her fingers were numb, but her mind stayed sharp. Each message she sent felt like lighting a candle in a dark room. Not bright, but enough. Enough to say, we're still here. Odette traveled under a new name now. Madame Lefebvre. She wore a green brooch. It was her signal. If she turned it sideways, it meant danger. If she wore it upright, the coast was clear. She passed checkpoints with a forged identity card and a birth certificate, written in careful ink by someone she would never meet. Every time a guard stared at her papers too long, she slowed her breathing, steadied her eyes, and smiled, and so softly, like a woman with nothing to hide. Lise was mapping a German airfield. She watched from a hillside for 3 days, slept in a ditch with rainwater at her feet, ate dry crackers, didn't speak once. She marked every hangar, every truck route, every change in the guard's rotation. Then she walked 12 miles to deliver the drawing. The commander in London called it perfect. She burned it 5 minutes later. Because in war, nothing you create can stay. Not even brilliance. Andrée received news that 2 of her drop zones were compromised. She stared at the message for a long time, then folded it and tucked it behind a loose stone in the cellar wall. That night, she opened a hidden panel in the floor and unpacked a fresh transmitter. She moved the operation to the bell tower of a ruined church. Each transmission echoed with the ghost of old prayers. But her hands never shook. Even in sacred ruins, she had a job to do. Odette met with a young courier in the corner booth of a quiet cafe. The girl looked terrified, shaking hands, eyes darting to every sound. Odette took her tea, poured 2 cups, added sugar. Then she said, "I was terrified too. The trick is to do it anyway." The girl nodded, then slid a letter across the table beneath a menu. They parted with a smile. No one would remember. But that letter saved 8 resistance fighters from arrest. A small moment. A giant shift. Lisa moved between cities now. She learned how to vanish in plain sight. She wore what the locals wore. Spoke slowly. Laughed politely when people spoke about the war, like it wasn't burning beneath their feet. In Marseille, she shared a room with a singer. They never asked each other questions, only past matches and stories that weren't true. It was safer that way. You couldn't betray what you didn't know. Andrée was tired. She hadn't slept properly in weeks. But sleep was not her priority. One night, as she tapped out a coded message, she whispered to herself, "You don't have to feel brave. You just have to be it." And the transmission went through, just in time. Because the next morning, that church was raided, but she was gone. Like smoke, Odette received a message. 1 line. "He's here. Stay low." She knew who it meant. The German officer, who had a list of suspected agents. She packed nothing, left everything behind. In 2 minutes, she became someone else. Again. On the train out of town, she stared at her reflection in the window. For a second, she didn't recognize the woman looking back. But then she blinked and nodded to herself. "I am the storm In the quiet, Lise got word of a sabotage mission, a rail line carrying weapons to Normandy. She didn't hesitate. She called on 2 farmers and a boy with clever fingers. They used saltpeter, sugar, and oil, made bombs in a barn, while cows stood quietly nearby. The next night, the explosion rippled through the hills, and the train never reached its target. London sent back 2 words. Good work. But no one else would ever know, and that was enough. The war had a scent now. Wet stone, gunpowder, ash in the seams of their coat. The women carried it without complaint. They weren't made of steel. They were made of something stronger, conviction wrapped in silence. Andrée moved to a village near Limoges. Her latest safe house was beneath a bakery. Each morning, she emerged covered in flour, face smudged like any ordinary worker. But at night, she became a conductor of whispers. The radio sang its quiet, Morse code song, and far away, London listened like a lover. Odette was now a ghost in Paris. She wore thick glasses and a nurse's coat, and a scarf too large for her face. She walked with a limp she didn't have. It made people look away. Each time she passed a soldier, she imagined her heartbeat was a pocket watch ticking steady, never changing. But inside, her thoughts were fire. She sent messages hidden in medical charts, tucked resistance orders in pill bottles, and once stitched a map into the lining of her skirt. You wouldn't think to look. That was the point. Lise had begun training others. She wasn't alone anymore. She became a teacher of shadows. She showed couriers how to fold letters into cigarette papers, how to greet Gestapo politely without blinking. One young woman, just 17, asked, "How do you know who to trust?" Lisa smiled softly. "You don't, but you trust the work. That's what lasts." And the girl nodded and kept going. But the noose was tightening. The enemy was learning. More checkpoints, more listening posts, more names on the list. Andrée changed her frequency. Twice. Then again. She was almost caught in a schoolhouse when a boy saw her climb out of a hidden cellar. He said nothing. Just watched her go. Later, he left a flower outside the cellar door. A blue iris. A sign of silence. She never saw him again, but she remembered. Odette received news that chilled her blood. Her old contact in Lyon had been taken. She was next. She could feel it. She met with her handler, Peter, in a cold cafe lit by one flickering bulb. They spoke as strangers. Nothing touched. Nothing revealed. But when they stood to leave, he slipped a piece of paper into her gloved hand. "They're coming. Go to the house by the river." She did. That night, she crossed through fields in heavy rain, barefoot to avoid sound. She stayed there for 6 days until the wind shifted. Then she moved again. Lisa's network was nearly uncovered. One of her young agents was caught with a radio part. He didn't talk. They beat him. He didn't talk. But it was enough for suspicion. She burned everything. Maps. Photos. Letters from London. She whispered goodbye to the old woman, who had let her sleep beneath the floorboards. Then she rode, all night, across the countryside, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a story too heavy for words. Some nights, the sky looked like it was listening. Andrée sat on a rooftop beton, watching the clouds drift across the moon. She wondered, just for a moment, what her mother would say if she could see her now. Would she be proud? Would she cry? She didn't know. So she closed her eyes and listened to the quiet. The kind of quiet only the brave understand. Odette's luck was running out. She was scheduled to meet with Peter again, but he didn't show. Instead, two men approached her on the street. All too well dressed. She knew immediately. The arrest was swift. She didn't struggle. They took her bag and her coat, her name, but not her courage. Never that. Lise received word. Odette taken. Maybe compromised. Scatter. She went underground. New name, new story, new face. But that night, she cried for the first time in months. Not because Odette was caught, but because the world had one less whisper in it, and the silence felt heavier than ever. Sleep now. Breathe slower. Let the cold night drift past you. The women are still here. Even when captured, even when hunted, even when alone, they remain. In every choice made in darkness, for the sake of light, the walls were white. Too white. Odette sat in a chair bolted to the floor. The room had no clock, no sound, only questions, and silence. The Gestapo interrogated her for hours, then days, then weeks. They asked for names, places, codes. She gave them none. She invented a husband, said he was the real leader, that she was just a courier, unimportant. They believed her, or pretended to. But the beatings didn't stop. Still, she stayed quiet, because silence was her resistance. Andrée didn't know about Odette yet. She kept working, moving. She knew something was wrong. London had stopped responding to one of her codes. But she didn't stop. In Montluçon, she sabotaged a German supply route, detonated a charge under a bridge that left tanks stranded for 3 crucial days. It wasn't enough to turn the tide, but it was enough to slow it. And sometimes, slowing is everything. Lise had taken in a new recruit, a girl named Renee. Sharp mind, steady nerves. Lise taught her the codes, the routes, the rules. Then one evening, as they watched the sun set over a ruined orchard, Renee asked, "Do you think we'll survive this?" Lise answered, "We didn't come here to survive. We came to win. Survival is just extra." Renee smiled, then looked away. The silence between them was the deepest part of the night. Odette was moved to Frame prison, then to Germany, to Ravensbrück. Each step stripped another layer of who she used to be. But at her center, something remained. She sang in her mind. French lullabies, lines of poetry, the names of her daughters. The guards never heard them, but they were louder than any scream she refused to give. Andrée received her final orders. A large drop was coming. Weapons, supplies, agents. She had to prepare the field outside a town where no one could be trusted. She walked the entire perimeter herself, checked the wind, marked the clearing with stones and a torn red cloth. When the plane came, she stood beneath the trees, watching parachutes bloom like petals. One agent landed hard, twisted ankle. She carried him to the edge of the forest and on her back. No one ever forgot that. Not even him. Lise was now working with the British directly. Her messages were marked urgent. Her name was whispered in strategy rooms back in London. But still, she stayed in the shadows. One morning, and she passed a German officer on the stairs. He tipped his hat. She nodded, then walked on, counting her breaths, until she reached the roof. There, she sat and cried. Not out of fear, but because she had learned how easy it was to become invisible. Even when you were saving the world, Odette became a symbol in prison. The other women watched her, listened. She taught them to memorize poems, to whisper fake names, so they could never betray real ones. She smuggled messages in scraps of soap, in hymns, in her own skin. Even when her body weakened, her mind stayed bright. She had become more than a woman. She had become the voice inside silence, saying, "Not yet. Not broken. Still here." Andrée didn't survive the war. She was captured near the end. Executed in a prison courtyard before dawn. No trial. No words. Just the echo of all she never said. But in London, when news reached her old radio team, one officer stood and said, "She never failed a single mission." And in silence, they all saluted her empty chair. Lise survived. She lived through the war, changed names again, vanished from the records, like a whisper that knew when to leave. Years later, in a quiet house in the countryside, a young girl asked her, "Did you really fight in the war?" Lise smiled and said, "No, I lived in it." Then she went back to her knitting and didn't say another word. You've come far, dear listener, through fire and fog, through trains and radios and names never carved in stone. Let your breath deepen now. Let the night close gently around you. The D-Day girls never sought glory. They only wanted to do what was right. The D-Day girls are waiting, and the storm is coming. Spring returned to France, not gentle, not slow. It came like a breath held too long, finally released. The air was still heavy with fear, but something had shifted. Something old was beginning to crack, and from beneath it, a sound was rising. It was the sound of resistance. Lise moved fast now, faster than before. She traveled on trains packed with soldiers, through cities littered with checkpoints, across hills that had seen too much blood. She wasn't hiding anymore. Not completely. She was coordinating now, connecting cells, delivering plans, organizing strikes. She no longer feared being caught. She feared being too late. Odette remained in Ravensbrück, her body weaker, but her fire untouched. The other prisoners watched her. Still, she held their hope in her hand, and even when hers shook from hunger, she told them stories of forests, of beaches, of a France that would someday breathe again. She didn't lie. She didn't promise survival. Only that the world would change, and that they had helped shape it. The Allies were preparing. England buzzed with movement. Planes, maps, orders wrapped in silence. D-Day was coming. And every woman behind enemy lines was a thread in the plan. Andrée's network, though shattered, had not died. The codes she had written still lived in radio rooms. The safe houses she built still stood, hidden like seeds beneath the frost. Her silence was still speaking. Lise now carried a pistol. She didn't want to, but London insisted. She hid it in a cloth pouch sewn into her coat lining. She never fired it. She hoped she never would. But when she walked through Paris that spring, she walked taller, because the enemy was no longer invincible. He was bleeding, and they had helped cut him. In small villages, old women began hanging blue ribbons on the backs of chairs. Bakers slipped resistance leaflets between loaves of rye bread. The songs sung at night carried new verses, songs of returning. And in these small, defiant acts, the silence began to fracture. One morning Lise, entered a church where she was to meet with a contact. A man sat in the last pew, reading a prayer book upside down. She sat beside him, spoke softly. "They're ready," she said. He nodded, then passed her a packet with dates, names, and locations. It was the plan. Sabotage to begin within hours of D-Day. Rail lines, communication posts, roads. The resistance would strike like lightning. Not to win the war, but to help it arrive sooner. Odette lay on a cot in the prison infirmary. Her ribs bruised, her fever high. She saw snow, even though it was spring. But in the haze, she whispered one word again and again. Soon. 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 She didn't know why. Only that the world was holding its breath. And when it let go, everything would change. In Normandy, children played near fields where parachutes would fall. They didn't know. Not yet. But the wind carried something unfamiliar. Not fear. Anticipation. Lise rode through a valley at dusk. Her bicycle rattled. Her hands ached. But her eyes sparkled. She had just delivered a message that would bring down a bridge used for transporting panzer tanks. The strike would be in 48 hours. She smiled. At the trees, at the road, at the sky turning gold. Not because the danger was gone, but because it was finally worth it. Every moment. Every name lost. Every breath hidden behind silence. Night fell slowly across France. Not with peace, but with pressure. It felt like standing just before a storm won. Just the weight of something coming. The resistance waited. Listened. Held their breath. Every hour was a countdown. Lise was in the countryside now. She rode from village to village, passing orders tucked inside the lining of her hat. She met with farmers, in barns, under stars, beside broken walls. Her voice was calm, but her words carried weight. "Tomorrow night," she whispered, "cut the wires, block the roads, leave no trace." And every person she spoke to nodded and began preparing. Not one refused. They all knew the war was on their doorstep, and they were ready to answer it. In Paris, a piano tuner left a small package beneath the third stair of a school building. Inside, a map, a key, a timer. He never said a word, just walked home and sat by his wife, as though nothing had changed. But it had. All across France, hands were moving. Not loud, not fast, but in perfect coordination. Like music no one else could hear. Odette lay in her bunk, eyes open in the dark. Far away, the guards drank and laughed. They didn't know, but she did. She didn't need a calendar, or a radio, or a message carved in code. She could feel it. The rhythm had changed. The silence was breaking. And something inside her stood up, even though her body could not. Lise met with an old resistance friend she hadn't seen since winter. They embraced for just a moment, then got to work. They reviewed targets, bridges, signal stations, fuel depots. They spoke in half sentences. They knew what the other meant, without finishing their thoughts. Before they parted, he said, "Lise, if this is it." She cut him off with a nod and whispered, "Then we do it well." Andrée's name was now spoken in whispers, like legend. Though she was gone, her codes were still used, her tactics still taught. In a safe house in Reims, a young girl repeated Andrée's process for securing a transmission line. She had never met her, but she moved with the same stillness, the same focus. Because sometimes a name is more than a person. Sometimes it's a torch and passed forward through time. Lise crossed the checkpoint 2 hours before curfew. The soldier glanced at her forged papers, nodded, let her go. As she walked away, her hands were steady, but her heart thudded onslaught and slow. She let it happen, then pushed it away. There was still more to do. Messages pulsed through radios, hidden beneath floorboards and haylofts. The code was short, simple. The tide will rise. It meant go. It meant now. And in dozens of towns, women turned to their husbands, to their sons, to themselves, and began to move. Knives were hidden in baskets of bread. Explosives packed into wooden crates. Roads mapped for sabotage were walked one last time before being blown to dust. Lise sat in a church pew as bells rang the hour. She closed her eyes, breathed slowly, folded the last message in her pocket, and placed it inside a hymn book. Then she lit a candle, not for prayer, for memory. And in that flame, she saw the faces of every woman who had brought her here. Andrée, Odette, the nameless couriers, the housewives who had offered shelter with shaking hands. They had made this moment, and she would carry it through. You're nearly there now. You can feel it too, can't you? The slow build, the rising heat beneath the silence. June 5th, 1944. Night. The wind shifted. Not loud, not sharp, but enough. Enough for the foxes to pause in the fields, for men in watchtowers to look twice at the horizon, for 1,000 quiet warriors to step forward from silence into purpose. It was time. Lise received the signal in a whisper passed from cyclist to priest, to farmer to schoolboy. It was simple, clear. Strike after midnight. She didn't run. She didn't rush. She walked into the barn where explosives had waited for weeks, hidden in sacks of grain. She lit the first fuse with hands that didn't shake. The detonations thundered into the hills, and in that sound, the war began to turn. Across the country, they moved. Saboteurs, teachers, butchers, mothers. Men and women who had stayed quiet for so long now screamed with action. Railways vanished in flame. Wires were sliced. Fuel dumps burst skyward like shooting stars. And the Nazis turned their heads west, just as the Allies wanted. Because distraction was part of the plan. Odette lay still in her cot. She didn't know the exact hour, but she felt it. She whispered to the woman beside her, "Listen." The woman shook her head. "I hear nothing." "Exactly," Odette said, and smiled. Because the silence outside the camp wasn't empty. It was charged, like the breath before thunder. In Normandy, the first boots hit sand. But back in the heart of France, resistance fighters were already clearing the way. And many of those clearing it were women. They didn't wear medals. They wore worn shoes and aprons. But they carried explosives and faith. Because sometimes the sharpest weapons come wrapped in cloth and courage. Lise rode through the dark with a young boy on the back of her bicycle. He held a satchel of detonators. He was 12. She didn't ask why he volunteered. He didn't explain. They just worked, silently, quickly. And when the job was done, she let him sleep in a barn full of hay and moonlight. When he woke, the tide had turned, and he had helped turn it. In a quiet farmhouse, a woman brewed coffee. and handed it to a passing soldier, dressed in English green. She didn't ask where he came from, or how he got there. She simply gave him warmth, then pointed toward the road. They understood each other without speaking. That, too, was resistance. In the early hours, German trucks rolled past burned bridges and torn tracks. Confused, slower. The Wehrmacht wasn't used to this kind of war. Not one fought in whispers, in hiding places, in kitchens and schoolrooms. But this was the war the D-Day girls had mastered, and now the enemy was drowning in it. Lise reached her final target just before sunrise, a communications relay on a hillside. She and two others cut wires, smashed equipment, then vanished into trees before anyone could respond. By the time the Germans arrived, the hill was empty. Just birds, wind, and the faint scent of burnt wires. It was enough. As the sun rose over France, the beaches filled with soldiers, ships, flags. But the real beginning had already happened. It began in the night, with women like Lise, with a radio, a bicycle. A lie told well, a fuse lit with care. D-Day didn't just arrive. It was made. And it was made in silence. Dawn bled across the sky like a wound finally healing. The invasion had begun. Troops poured into Normandy. Ships filled the horizon. The sky hummed with Allied aircraft. But in the heart of France, the war was still a whisper, still hidden, still dangerous. Lise stood at the edge of a forest clearing. Smoke curled from the bridge behind her, now just rubble and twisted steel. Her work was done, but there was no time for rest. She walked 3 miles east to deliver word to a nearby cell. No thanks, no medals, just a nod, and more work to do. Because the silence was broken, but the noise of freedom wasn't yet safe. Odette woke in pain, her ribs still bruised, her breath thin. But something had changed. The guards were louder now. Their voices carried panic, urgency. The routine had cracked. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself on a single thought she hadn't dared speak. We might win. All over France, resistance groups struck harder. Not just sabotage, but direct conflict. Ambushes. Assassinations. Derailments. The people were rising. Not in anger. In resolve. They had waited for the moment. Now they became it. Lise received a new order. Escort a British officer to a hidden command post in the countryside. She met him beneath an old aqueduct. He looked exhausted, but smiled when she arrived. "You're Lise?" he asked. She nodded. He chuckled softly. "You're the reason and we got this far." She didn't respond. Just led him through the hills in silence. Villages welcomed Allied soldiers with bread and wine and trembling hands. But the war was not over. There were mines on the roads, snipers in steeples, booby-trapped homes. And still, the women worked, carrying messages, tending the wounded, mapping the routes ahead. They didn't ask how long it would take, only where they were needed next. In a schoolhouse in the Loire Valley, a resistance courier named Elise sat at a child's desk, rewriting Allied radio logs to remove real names. She had been trained by Lise. She worked quickly, quietly. When a soldier asked how she learned to code, she said, "A woman showed me." He didn't ask more. But he never forgot the look in her eyes, like someone who had already survived too many endings. Odette heard the news from a new prisoner, a girl fresh from the outside. The Allies had landed. France was rising. Odette smiled, then whispered, "Don't tell the guards. Let them feel the silence before it crushes them." Lise watched from a ridge as a convoy of Allied jeeps moved below. The wind smelled like diesel, earth, and something else. Hope. For the first time, she let herself believe it might truly be ending. That all those nights in barns, and all the coded phrases, all the risks, they hadn't been for nothing. The sky turned gold, soft. Birds returned to power lines. Children stepped into roads again. Old men lit pipes they'd kept hidden for years. And the women, the quiet ones, the shadow walkers, they didn't stop. Because even as the enemy retreated, there were still people to protect, leaves to rebuild, stories to preserve. They didn't want glory. They wanted peace. The earth was still scorched. But now flowers bloomed in cracks. Birds sang again. And sometimes, if you listened carefully, you could hear a door open that had been shut for years. Lise sat at a kitchen table in a farmhouse with no name, her boots off, her shoulders finally relaxed. Across from her, a British colonel she had helped guide across the fields of northern France. He offered her tea. She took it and sipped slowly. They didn't speak about the bridges, the missions, the friends lost. They just let the silence settle, like dust in sunbeams. Sometimes, peace is not a parade. It's a warm drink, and no questions. Odette was still in Ravensbrück. But things had shifted. The guards were less cruel, less confident. Rumors floated like smoke Berlin was falling. The Allies were advancing. Hitler was hiding. One afternoon, a German officer entered her cell with trembling hand and offered her a coat. No explanation. She didn't thank him. She simply took it and wrapped it tight. Because when you've lost so much, you learn to carry warmth wherever you find it. In Lyon, resistance fighters gathered to burn false IDs, bury weapons, erase safe house maps, not out of fear, but because the war was shifting into something new. The silence that had once protected them could now become a trap. It was time to emerge, time to speak. Lise walked through Paris, not hiding, not running. She passed soldiers, drinking coffee in cafes, children waving small flags, a woman playing an accordion beside the Seine. She stopped, listened, and smiled. She hadn't heard music in daylight for years, and in that moment, it felt louder than any explosion. In the countryside, a small church rang its bell, not for mass, but for reunion. Inside, a man found his sister, who had been missing since 1942. She hugged him, then handed him a photograph of a woman he didn't recognize. "She saved me," she whispered. "Her name was Lise, I think." Then she smiled and wept. Odette's prison block was abandoned. No guards, no orders, just cold wind and silence. A fellow prisoner broke a window, and they stepped into the forest, barefoot, thin as shadows. Odette didn't run. She walked slowly, deliberately. She was still in pain, still unsure if she would ever see home. But for the first time, she could choose her direction, and that was enough. At a train station in Reims, a young girl kissed her mother for the first time in 4 years. Her mother had spent the war as a courier, a ghost, a whisper. Now she returned, with gray in her hair and calluses on her feet. But her eyes, they still burned bright. She looked around the crowd and said softly, "We're not the same. We never will be." Lise received word that the war in Europe was officially over. She was standing in a field when she read it. She folded the paper, put it in her pocket, and sat in the grass. She didn't cry. She didn't cheer. She lay down, looked up at the sky, and listened. The birds were back. The silence was different now. It no longer meant fear. It meant peace. Paris was alive again. Banners flew from the balconies. Children danced in the streets. Laughter returned like a melody long forgotten. But in the corners, in the quiet cafes, in the spaces between the celebration, there were ghosts. Not all the D-Day girls returned. And those who did carried stories like scars. Odette stepped off a military plane at a small British airfield. She was thinner, paler, but whole. She walked slowly toward her daughters. They ran to her. She knelt and wept into their hair. No medals, no headlines, just the sound of home. And in that moment, the war was over. Lise gave her final report to a British commander in a quiet office overlooking the Thames. She listed names, dates, confirmed sabotage targets, documented the dead. When she finished, he stood and offered his hand. "Well done," he said. She didn't take it. Instead, she looked out the window and said, "I'm tired." Then she left, and was never seen in public again. France held trials, punished collaborators, raised monuments, sang old songs in crowded halls. But the women of the resistance, many of them, were forgotten, their records buried, their deeds erased. Because they hadn't fought with guns, they fought with silence. And the world forgets silence far too quickly. Years passed. Lise lived quietly in a village near the sea. She kept bees, read books, drank tea at dusk. Sometimes strangers would visit, historians, journalists, curious young women with notebooks and bright eyes. They asked for her stories. She offered them bread instead, then sat in silence. Because some stories were not meant to be told. They were meant to be carried. Odette gave interviews, spoke at memorials, stared down generals, and told the truth of what she had endured. When asked what she feared most, she said, "Forgetting. Not by me, by you." She died in her home on a quiet afternoon, the radio playing a song she once taught to prisoners in Ravensbrück. One girl a new resistance courier grew up and named her daughter after Andrée. She kept her photograph in a small locket worn close to her chest. The child never met her namesake. But every time she asked who she was, her mother said she was a thunderclap hidden in rain. And that was all. It was enough. Years later, at a museum in Normandy, a boy read the name of a woman he'd never heard of. He turned to his teacher and asked, "Was she a soldier?" The teacher smiled. No, she was the reason soldiers had a path to walk on. The boy stood quietly, then whispered, "Thank you," to no one, and to all of them. The war ended, but their legacy never did, because the night was long, and they stayed awake. Because the world was wounded, and they stitched it back together, one silent act at a time. And because history may forget what silence sounded like, but the world we live in was built upon it. The war was over, but the world was quiet in a new way. Not from fear, from absence. Streets no longer echoed with boots. Trains ran again. shops open. And still, something was missing. It wasn't the sound. It was the people. Lise stood on a train platform in Lyon. A young woman approached her, holding a newspaper. On the front page, soldiers returning, flags waving, men smiling. No mention of couriers, or radios, or women. The girl asked, "Will they remember us?" Lise looked down the tracks, then said, "They won't, but we will." Odette spoke at a war tribunal in Nuremberg. The courtroom was cold, the walls high and pale. Across from her, the faces of those who once ordered her pain. She gave names, dates, testimony. She did not shake. She did not cry. She ended with this: "You tried to break us, but we became something you couldn't touch." France began to heal. Not quickly, not cleanly. There were parades. There were trials. There were graves. And in every village, there were women who returned to kitchens, to gardens, to silence. Not because they had nothing more to say, but because they had already said everything that mattered in the way they lived. In a quiet mountain town, a school teacher resumed her lessons. She had once delivered explosives in satchels of books. Now she taught poetry. One day, a student asked, "Why are you not in the history books?" She smiled, then wrote one word on the blackboard: "Because." Lise was offered a medal. She declined it. Not because she wasn't proud, but because it felt wrong to stand in a room of polished shoes and speeches when so many had never returned home. She sent a letter instead. It read, "I was never alone. If you honor me, you must name them all." No one could. So the letter was archived and forgotten. Odette lit a candle every year on June 6th. Not for victory, for memory. Each year, the flame burned a little longer before going out. She would sit alone, tea cooling beside her, and whisper the names of those still missing. No one else heard, but the candle did. The world moved on. Men rebuilt cities. Governments signed papers. Lines were drawn on maps. And the women, who had once carried the war on their backs, walked among the crowd without applause. Not bitter, not forgotten, just unseen, like shadows that saved the light. Lise tended the garden, wildflowers, tomatoes, rows of thyme and lavender. When a neighbor asked her why she never spoke of the war, she answered softly, "Because every seed is a story, and stories grow best in silence." Then she knelt, dirt beneath her nails, and planted another row. "You've returned to this place again, the edge of sleep, the weightless space between memory and dream. Let your breath slow. The world has changed. Because they changed it. The silence may have ended, but their echoes remain." The war had ended on paper, but for many it hadn't ended in their bones. Silence no longer meant danger. Now it meant grief, a slow, strange kind. Not loud, not sudden, just always there, like fog. Odette visited the British War Office. She brought a list. Names she remembered. Faces that had vanished. Some were confirmed lost. Others were missing. Others simply erased. She asked if there would be a memorial. The officer said, "Perhaps, eventually." She left quietly. And that night, she carved every name she remembered into the wood of her table. That was her memorial. Lise walked the streets of Marseille. She wore a scarf now and moved slower than she once did. She found a bookstore and bought a volume of Baudelaire, sat at a cafe and read it aloud to herself. No codes, no missions. Just words. Beautiful, soft, and useless in war. And that, finally, was the point. In a town near Rouen, a woman gave birth to a daughter. She named her after the code name she once used during the resistance. She told no one what it meant. But whenever she held the child, she whispered, "You are not born from peace. You are born from purpose," and kissed her forehead like a seal of quiet defiance. Odette was asked to write her story. She began to. 3 pages in, she stopped. Not because she forgot, because memory was heavy, too heavy to carry alone. She placed the pages in a drawer beside a broken comb and a small wooden rosary. Sometimes remembering isn't about writing it down. It's about letting it live, only where it hurts. A young journalist found Lise. She asked about her time in the resistance. Lise didn't answer directly. She said, "I loved someone during the war." The journalist asked, "Did he die?" Lise smiled. "No, but the version of me he loved did." And that was all. In Paris, a reunion was held for surviving resistance members. Only 12 women arrived. They didn't wear uniforms. They wore scarves and hats and shoes that had walked too far. They hugged each other tightly, laughed, cried. They shared wine and silence. At the end, they lit a candle and let it burn down to nothing. No speeches, no anthem, just one final moment to be together as they had once been, unseen, but unstoppable. One girl, just 16 when the war ended, became a nurse. Each night, she would light a single lamp and tell her patients a story about a woman who once outran a Gestapo car on a bicycle with a broken chain. None believed her, but all of them smiled, and sometimes healed faster. Because stories, even the unbelievable ones, can save us in ways bullets never could. Odette visited a quiet lake where her husband had once proposed. She stood still for a long time, then placed a folded piece of paper on the water. It read, "I survived, but not as the same person. She stayed behind. I only brought her name with me." Then she watched it drift away. The years passed, quietly, softly, but the kind of silence that doesn't come from fear, but from forgetting. The world moved on, rebuilt, replanted, reimagined. But for the women of the resistance, moving on was not so simple. Odette took up painting. Small canvases, muted colors, mostly scenes of forests and empty chairs. When someone asked her why no faces, she said, "Because those I see aren't here anymore." Then she smiled and changed the subject. Lise lived by the sea. She kept to herself, still listened to the radio every night, as if waiting for a signal that would never come again. She baked bread, fed stray cats, wrote nothing. Some days, a local child would visit just to hear her stories, not of war of bees and stars, and how silence can sometimes mean safety. One by one, the others passed away, some quietly in hospital, some holding the hands of grandchildren, some with no one to remember, but the wind outside their windows. But they were never truly gone. They were in archives, in journals, in lines of code still taught to spies today, and in the scars on old wooden floorboards, where radios once hummed in the dark. A filmmaker once tracked down Odette to ask for her story. She refused to be interviewed, but she handed him a single photograph of 3 women smiling in front of a crumbled wall. No names. No explanation. Just a whisper. Don't tell it big. Tell it small. That's how we lived. He never forgot that. And his film years later began with the sound of a match being struck in the dark. Lisa's neighbor found her one morning, watching the sunrise, wrapped in a wool coat. In her lap, a map. Not of France, not of the war. A map of the night sky, with little red marks, where she had once memorized star patterns for night missions. She looked at the neighbor and said, "They never found me because they followed the stars, and they don't betray you." Some of the women were honored, eventually. A medal, a statue, a name carved into stone, in a place tourists never visit. But most of them, they didn't need that. They just wanted quiet. A place to plant things. A face to kiss goodnight. Because they had already lived through the worst of what humans can do. Now they wanted proof of what we can heal. In a dusty library in Oxford, a young student researching resistance networks came across a name in the margin of a declassified file. Lise. No last name. Just Lise. He followed it for months. Hit walls. Found rumors. Scanned microfilm. Then he found a letter, written by her hand. It ended with this: "I lived for cause. I lost friends for cause. But the thing I'm proudest of, is that I love people, even when it hurt to." He framed it, hung it in his study, and every time he doubted the world, he read it again. Odette's last word, whispered to her nurse, were simple. "Did we do enough?" The nurse replied, "You gave us the chance to try." And Odette closed her eyes, not with fear, but with peace. Somewhere in Normandy, a girl walks past a crumbling wall covered in ivy. She doesn't know that this used to be a resistance drop point, that beneath it, a woman once hid maps and fuses wrapped in linens disguised as bread deliveries. To her, it's just stone and moss, and that's okay, because the stone remembers. There's an old farmhouse in Brittany with a loose floorboard in the attic. If you lift it, you'll find a rusted pen, a half-burned photo, and the casing of a radio tube. No plaque, no marker. Just evidence that someone, at some time, risked everything for someone they never met. And that's how history breathes. Not through fireworks, through fingerprints. In Marseille, a woman named Genevieve once smuggled soldiers through sewer tunnels. She was never caught. She never spoke of it. She died a grandmother, a baker, a soft voice in a warm home. At her funeral, only one man knew, a former soldier, bent with age. He left a bouquet wrapped in old resistance codes, and then walked away. Lisa's grave is simple. No titles, no ranks, just her name, a date, and the words, "She listened when others were silent." Tourists walk by. Sometimes they stop. Most of the time they don't. But every year, on the anniversary of D-Day, when someone leaves wildflowers, no one knows who. And that's exactly right. A teacher in England once gave a history assignment. Find someone who helped win the war without using a gun. A boy wrote about his great-grandmother. He said she used to wake at 3 a.m. to go out walking. Only later did he learn those walks were missions, that her umbrella was a signal, that her purse carried false papers. He wrote, "She was the quietest person I ever knew, and the bravest." He got full marks. In a dusty file cabinet in the French Interior Ministry, there's a folder labeled "Unconfirmed Female Operatives." Inside, names with missing details. photographs without labels, stories no one finished writing. But they were real. And maybe, somewhere, they're still alive in memories, in family dinners, in the habits passed down like recipes. The way someone always locks the window twice, or always keeps a small knife in her coat. Odette's daughter wrote a book. It wasn't about war. It was about gardens. But on page 47, beneath a story about planting tulips, she wrote, "My mother once smuggled dynamite in a loaf of bread. She taught me how to wait in silence until it was time to act." That was all. But anyone who read it felt something stir. There are statues in London, Paris, Warsaw, but most don't have faces. Just cloaks, or shadows, or nameless figures in bronze. Because not every hero needs to be recognized. Some just need to be remembered, even if only in whispers. Lise once said, "The world will not remember our names, but it will live because of what we did." She was right. The lights we see now, the peace we feel tonight, was born in the darkest moments, by those who stayed awake when the world slept. In a small museum in Caen, there is a faded jacket behind glass. The label simply reads, "Worn by a wireless operator, 1944. Visitors pause. Some walk past. But every so often, a girl stops, presses her hand to the glass, and stares, as if she knows what it meant to speak without sound. Odette's granddaughter became a teacher. On the last day of every term, she lit a candle and asked her students to name someone brave they'd never met. They spoke of astronauts, of revolutionaries, of saints. And one child said, "My aunt. She once hid a man in her barn because he was scared." That was enough. Because courage wears many coats, some stitched in secret. Lisa's garden still blooms. Someone tends it. No one knows who. The tomatoes are red, the lavender thick, and there's a carved sign near the gate. If you've ever kept a secret for someone else's sake, this garden is yours. People leave letters there, folded and pressed beneath stones. Words no one reads aloud, truths meant only for the soil. There's a woman in Toulouse who trains radio technicians. She begins each course with a story of a message sent across enemy lines with a spoon in a broken mirror. She never says who sent it, but she ends every lecture with, "You owe more to silence than you think," and lets that sit in the air. In an archive in London, a young researcher found a coded letter signed with the name Violette. It was never decrypted. Not during the war. Not after. But he framed it anyway. Hung it by his desk. And every time he got stuck, he looked at it and remembered that brilliance doesn't always demand attention. Sometimes it works best unseen. At a memorial in Arromanches, children lay poppies. At the foot of unnamed stones, a plaque nearby reads, "For the women whose courage needed no witness." Some kids don't understand, but others linger, run their fingers across the letters, and feel something stir that they can't explain. That stirring, that's the echo. Odette's old journals were donated to a library after her passing. Most of the entries were mundane. Grocery lists, book titles, recipes. But on one page, scrawled in ink, nearly faded, "I lived through a storm, so my children could sleep in sun. And now, you sleep in it too." A playwright once created a fictional character based on the D-Day girls. The audience loved her wit, her quiet strength, her unbreakable calm. After the show, An old woman approached the playwright, took her hand. She wasn't fictional, the woman whispered. I knew 3 like her. And then she left, without another word. We don't always know whose footsteps we're following, but we walk in them anyway, because strength, once set loose in the world, does not disappear. It flows forward, through actions, through choices, through bedtime stories, told in hushed voices, to children who never knew war. The night is long. The world had changed. New wars had come and gone. New heroes were praised. New battles fought on different soil. But in the corners of dusty libraries, in old trunks beneath staircases, in folded letters tucked behind portraits, the D-Day girls still lived, waiting, quietly. A writer named Sarah opened her grandmother's chest one summer afternoon. She was looking for old recipes. Instead, she found resistance codes written on the back of photographs, a worn map with radio posts marked in red, and a medal still in its velvet box, never displayed. Sarah sat on the floor and cried, because no one had told her that the soft woman who sang lullabies once blew up train tracks in the dead of night. Stories began to rise again. Not in parades, but in pages. Daughters told what mothers had whispered. Grandchildren repeated what was once forbidden. And slowly, names began to surface. Odette, Violette, Lise, Andrée, Yvonne. Not characters, not legends. Women. Flesh and bone and fire. Museums, open quiet wings. Exhibits with broken compasses. Burned telegrams. Typewriters once used to spell life or death in 50 words or less. Visitors leaned close, reading fragments like prayers. Some left in silence. Some with tears. And some with a new word on their lips. Gratitude. A teacher in Belgium created a class project. Each student had to adopt a forgotten hero. One girl chose a woman named Lise. She didn't find much. Just a photo, a birth date, and a handwritten quote. I don't regret saving lives, even if it cost me mine. She turned in a simple, project no frills. But at the end, she wrote, I want to be like her. Not famous, just brave. And that line was posted on the school wall for years. In an old Paris bookstore, a biography appeared. Small print. Thin spine. Title, The Ones Who Fought in the Shadows. It sold slowly, quietly. But those who read it never forgot it. Because the truth has a sound. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Oh, Odette's voice, once nearly silenced in a prison cell, was later recorded in a BBC interview. She spoke gently, clearly. She didn't describe the torture. She spoke instead of small moments. A guard handing her a piece of bread. A message smuggled in a thread. A song hummed at night. She said, I remember kindness more than pain. That's what I want to pass on. And her voice now plays in a museum headset next to her photograph. Visitors stop walking when they hear her, as if her calm wraps around them like a blanket. Lisa's old friend, one of the last surviving couriers, was interviewed at age 92. When asked how she wanted to be remembered, she said, I don't. But if someone must, let them say I listened when others were afraid to speak, and I walked when it would have been easier to stay. Memory is not a museum. It's a campfire. Passed hand to hand, voice to voice, kept alive by warmth and care. It began with questions. Who were these women? Why didn't they tell us? Why were their names left out of the books? Why did their medals gather dust, while louder stories filled the shelves? A journalist named Claire discovered a line in a military report. Female agent delivered sabotage equipment on bicycle. No name, no date, just that. And Claire asked, "Why is this just a footnote?" So she followed it. Through archives, through whispers, through daughters who weren't sure what they were allowed to say. And years later, she published a book. It didn't make headlines, but it made hearts stop. Because in every line, the silence was broken. In a house near Bayeux, a boy found a pendant buried in his grandmother's flower bed. Inside, a tiny scrap of paper with a symbol he didn't recognize. He asked his mother. She didn't know. He asked his grandfather. The old man stared at it for a long time before answering. She saved people. She never told anyone. And now I think you should. So the boy wrote a story. It was printed in his school newspaper, titled, "My Grandma Fought Nazis and Planted Daisies." It went viral. And strangers wrote back, "Mine too." In France, a filmmaker created a documentary. Not dramatic. No slow-motion reenactments. Just interviews. Old hands. Old voices. Old truths. One woman said, "They taught us to never speak of it. But I think now we need to." And when the credits rolled, the audience didn't clap. They sat in silence, letting it sink in. Odette's story was finally published in full. It didn't sell millions, but one reader left a review online. I couldn't sleep after reading it, not because I was afraid, because I felt proud to be part of a world she helped protect. There's a monument now in Valenciennes, dedicated to the women of the SOE. It's made of stone and stillness. No grand arch, no spotlight, just a quiet place with a simple inscription. To the memory of those who risked everything and asked for nothing. Every year, someone leaves white roses, always without a note, and always in the morning before the crowd arrives. Lise's name was finally added to a government archive, not under combat, but under civic service. Because even in death, bureaucracy tried to shrink her. But beside the record, someone wrote in pencil. Also lit fires. Also moved mountains. Also saved lives. And that note has never been erased. A school teacher in Marseille made her students write thank you letters to someone from history who never got one. One girl wrote, "Dear Madame Resistance, you never met me, but you protected me before I was even born." The stories don't end. They echo. They pass through hands and paper, through voices and tears, until they find a resting place. Somewhere in southern France, a woman locks her window twice before bed. She doesn't know why. She just always has. Her grandmother used to do it. And before her, her mother. What she doesn't know is, in 1943, that second lock meant the safe house was closed for the night. A boy in England carries a small compass in his backpack. Not because he needs it, but because his aunt gave it to him and said, "It'll help you find your way if you're ever truly lost." She never told him that once, on a foggy road outside of Rouen, she used the same compass to guide 3 soldiers out of a German checkpoint. Now it's just a token, but still, it leads. There's a soup recipe passed down in a Polish family. Every time it's made, a small ritual is followed, a pinch of salt added with the left hand. No one knows why. No one asks. But it began with a code, a sign passed during wartime. Safe, no soldiers nearby. Now it just tastes like home. But it started as hope. Lisa's great niece became a musician. She never knew much about her aunt, only that she liked storms and wrote notes in the margins of books. One day, while going through an old chest, she found sheet music with dots and dashes scribbled into the staves. It wasn't a song. It was a transmission, a message that once crossed enemy lines. She wrote a song around it, called it Whispers Between Bombs. It played on the radio at midnight. No one knew its origin, but thousands fell asleep to it. And something in them felt brave. In New York, a poet performed at an open mic. Her piece was short. I want to be the kind of woman who rides her bike into danger with a note in her sleeve and a prayer in her teeth. Someone asked afterward if it was about love. She said, no, it's about war, and the women who made sure I'd never have to fight it. In a quiet village near Bordeaux, a bookstore hosts a once-a-year event called the Unnamed Hour. No ads, no fanfare. At midnight, readers gather by candlelight and take turns reading passages from books written about unknown heroines of the war. No one claps. They just listen. And when it ends, they walk home in silence, hearts full and trembling. Odette's old walking stick, carved with notches, now sits in her daughter's hallway. A child once asked what the notches meant. The daughter replied, steps, each one taken in courage. The child picked it up, took 3 steps, then put it back. That was enough. Lise once told a friend, I dreamed of a world where my daughter could walk home at night without fear. That dream didn't come true in full, but it came closer, because she rode through enemy forests when it was darkest. Dreams aren't always realized, but sometimes they're inherited. Odette dreamed of a kitchen with fresh flowers. Not medals, not memorials, just peace in a small space where nothing exploded and no one was hunted. She planted tulips every spring. Even when they didn't bloom, she called them victories. And every cup of tea she poured after the war was a rebellion against the past. One resistance woman, anonymous in every file, wrote a letter to herself on the eve of a dangerous mission. It said, if I return, I will live slowly. I will love loudly. And I will forget no one. She didn't return, but the letter was found and read aloud at her great-granddaughter's wedding. Her name was finally spoken, and her vow, in a way, was kept. Some dreams took shape in children. A little boy whose grandmother never spoke of the war grew up to become a human rights lawyer. He never knew why, only that he was drawn to defending the voiceless. Later, he found a photograph of his grandmother holding a resistance badge. Suddenly, it made sense. He wasn't just following his dream. He was following hers, too. A girl named Clara wore her grandmother's scarf to every school exam. Not because it was lucky, but because she said it smelled like bravery. The scarf once carried forged documents in its hem. Now it carries courage in the mind of a student who wants to build a quieter world. A teacher handed her students a prompt. If you could say thank you to one forgotten person from history, who would it be? One boy wrote, to the woman who tore out a page from her favorite book to leave a message that saved a family. I hope your story is told, even if I don't know your name. The teacher kept the paper, framed it, placed it next to her desk. for every child who came after. Even dreams buried in silence can find light again. A musician in Amsterdam composed a piece titled Code to Freedom. He had no military background, no connection to the war. But one day, he found a set of musical notes that didn't quite fit. When translated, they spelled out a resistance location. The piece opens with one violin in a sea of silence. By the end, the silence becomes harmony, a room of sound, a victory of remembrance. Dreams aren't always loud. Sometimes they're the whisper of a mother who made it home, the blink of a streetlight that once signaled safety, the rhythm of a typewriter that carried secrets across borders. Episode 3, Part 5, Echoes in the Quiet, Segment 5, 120, 00 to 150, 00. What do we inherit from silence? Not always answers. Not always explanations. Sometimes we inherit habits. Sometimes the weight of unfinished stories. Sometimes just a feeling that someone before us was brave in ways we'll never fully understand. Odette's daughter used to walk barefoot on the garden path. She didn't know why. Her mother once did the same, to avoid making noise when the Gestapo patrolled. But for the daughter, it became peace. Something once born of fear, transformed into something gentle. That's how healing begins. Lise never taught her children to fight. She taught them to listen. She'd say, silence can mean fear, or it can mean love. You have to know the difference. One of her sons became a therapist. He said his mother taught him how to sit with people's pain without flinching. She never told him how much pain she'd sat with in silence. A woman named Emily taught school for 40 years. Her students adored her. They never knew she once carried cyanide in her pocket in case she was captured. When asked what her greatest accomplishment was, she said, "I made sure children could sleep through storms." That was all she wanted, and all she needed to say. In an attic in Normandy, a child found an old suitcase. Inside, a set of keys, a photograph of 3 women in trench coats, and a scarf stitched with coded patterns. The parents had no idea where it came from, only that it belonged to a great aunt no one spoke of. The child brought the scarf to school for show and tell, held it like treasure. One teacher recognized the symbols, understood what it meant, and whispered, "You come from fire." There are lessons carved into the ordinary. How to bake with limited flour. How to speak in layers. How to notice small changes in your environment. These aren't just quirks. They're survival passed down. Taught not in fear, but in love. Odette's favorite phrase was, just a little more. A little more patience. A little more strength. A little more light. Even when her body was failing, she said it. Her granddaughter painted these words on the wall above her bed. And now, every night, they are the last thing she sees. Before sleep, we don't always realize when we're being taught. Sometimes a glance is a whole lesson. Sometimes a quiet hand on the shoulder is a lifetime's worth of reassurance. These women, the D-Day girls, taught us not just how to fight, but how to live afterward, how to rest, how to rebuild, how to hold silence without being broken by it. Close your eyes now. Let your breath match the rhythm of their slow, steady, unshaken. You are surrounded by ghosts, but not the kind that haunt. These are the ones who hold you. Somewhere in a drawer long untouched, there's a brooch with a missing clasp. It once held the corner of a map in place, while a girl, barely 17, sent coordinates through trembling fingers. Now it rests in velvet. Not displayed, not praised, just there. Like her story, like her name. Almost lost, but not quite. In a village in northern France, an old man lights a candle each June 6th. He doesn't explain why. He just says, "I knew someone once. She saved me." No further questions. Just flame, memory, and silence. Odette once wrote, "I didn't win the war, but I kept a promise to the living." And she did. By surviving. By continuing. By planting daisies where ash once fell. There's a plaque in London's Mall unnoticed. It reads, "In memory of those who disappeared so that others might remain." Not everyone who helped left a name, but all left a mark. And tonight, that mark is stitched quietly in your chest. You feel it, don't you? That calm, that stillness, that knowing that someone once risked their future so you could rest easy in yours. A bedtime story is not always soft, but it is always sacred. Because in the hush of your room, in the weight of your pillow, you are not alone. You sleep beneath the wings of women who moved without applause, who wrote freedom in invisible ink, who hid radios inside coats and light inside fear. So as this part closes, don't try to remember every name. Just remember the feeling, the warmth of their footsteps echoing in your dreams, the way they held steady so you could fall asleep. You are here, alive, breathing, because they were, and now you carry them forward. Good night, dreamer. We'll return soon with part 6, and with it, the final curtain call for the women who turned silence into salvation.